Garlic and other charms. While not always a cure for an existing vampire, garlic, wild rose, and hawthorn branches were often placed in coffins, houses, or around thresholds to repel vampires. Bells were sometimes hung on graves, thought to ward off evil spirits. You can almost smell the acrid smoke of a ritual fire. Hear the whispered incantations in a language long dead. The fear wasn't just of the dead themselves, but of those who would willingly invite them into the world of the living. Necromancers were seen as dangerous intermediaries, figures who walked a perilous tightrope between humanity and the abyss, potentially dragging innocent souls into their sinister endeavors. Their very existence reinforced the idea that the boundaries of life and death were permeable, and that malevolent forces could cross them at will, or by invitation. You open your eyes, not to the soft glow of your smart device, but to the inky blackness of an ancient night. The air is cool and damp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. You're lying on a rough mat, perhaps in a simple hut, or a tent made of skins. Outside, the world is silent, save for the chirping of unseen insects and the distant hoot of an owl. You reach out, feeling the rough texture of the wall beside you, the cold, smooth stone of the floor. There are no sounds of cars, no distant city hum, just the raw, unfiltered sounds of nature. And as your eyes adjust to the gloom, you notice it a shadow, deeper than the rest, lurking in the corner of your peripheral vision. A shape that seems to shift, just slightly. When you try to focus on it, you know, instinctively, that you are not alone. This is not some abstract philosophical concept of the afterlife. This is the visceral, terrifying reality of a world where people truly believed that the veil between the living and the dead was gossamer thin. And sometimes, it tore. And honestly, if you're used to ordering pizza at 2 a.m., you probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in this environment before convincing yourself the delivery guy was actually a spectral entity coming for your soul. The tales of necromancy were not just about raising physical bodies, but about compelling spirits. These spirits might be summoned for various purposes. The belief that the dead could, and often did, walk among the living is perhaps one of the most universal and persistent fears in human history. It wasn't just a scary story told around a campfire. It was a deeply ingrained worldview that shaped rituals, influenced daily behavior, and even dictated the very structure of communities. From the earliest cave dwellers gazing into the flickering shadows cast by their fires, to the vast empires building elaborate tombs, the dead were never truly gone. They were simply somewhere else, sometimes just on the other side of a very thin wall, and sometimes they decided to pop back for a visit. Divination, to gain knowledge of the future, to find hidden treasures, or to reveal secrets. Consider the primal human experience. When someone died, they didn't just vanish. Their body remained slowly changing, decaying. Without a modern scientific understanding of biology, decomposition, or disease, the process of death would have been profoundly mysterious and terrifying. A living, breathing person, full of warmth and laughter, would suddenly become cold, still and unresponsive. Then, over time, the body would transform in horrifying ways. It was only natural for ancient peoples to seek explanations beyond the purely physical, to attribute these changes to unseen forces or the lingering presence of the departed spirit. This is where the seed of the walking dead was sown. Revenge to curse enemies, to cause harm, or to enact retribution on those who wronged them. One of the most common historical facts often cited for the widespread belief in the dead walking among us is the lack of a clear, definitive understanding of death itself in ancient societies. Unlike today, where medical professionals can confirm death with certainty, ancient peoples often relied on observable signs, which could sometimes be misleading. Cases of catalepsy, severe comas, or certain metabolic disorders could mimic death, leading to individuals being buried alive. Imagine the sheer horror of a dead loved one suddenly stirring in their coffin, or being heard scratching from beneath the earth. Such rare but terrifying occurrences would have solidified the belief that the dead could indeed return, or that some remained trapped between worlds. Power to gain influence, control over others, or superhuman abilities. Think about it, you've meticulously prepared your loved one for burial. Perhaps wrapped them in shrouds, placed them in a simple grave. Days or weeks later, tales emerge of strange sounds near the burial site. Worse, the grave is disturbed, and the body found in an unnatural position. While we now understand decomposition and gas buildup can cause bodies to shift, to an ancient mind, this was undeniable proof that the deceased was restless, trying to escape, or even actively rising from their grave. These real-world, albeit misinterpreted, observations provided powerful evidence for the walking dead. It's like when your phone suddenly restarts itself and you're convinced it's haunted. Except back then, the stakes were a lot higher than losing your game progress. Love spells, in some darker forms of love magic, commanding a spirit to influence another person's affections. This fear wasn't confined to a single culture, it was a global phenomenon. In ancient Mesopotamia, you'd find elaborate funerary rituals aimed at ensuring the dead stayed dead and didn't return as angry Ekamu vengeful spirits. In Egypt, the meticulous mummification process wasn't just about preparing the soul for the afterlife. It was also, in part, a way to ensure the body remained intact, allowing the Ka and Bay parts of the soul to return, but preventing the deceased from wandering as a malevolent specter. They went to incredible lengths to make sure their dead were properly housed and respected, all to prevent an unwanted return. Each of these purposes reveals a deep human yearning, a desire to transcend limitations, but twisted into a dark, forbidden art. The cost was often perceived to be the necromancer's own soul, or the unleashing of uncontrolled demonic forces upon the world. It was a Faustian bargain, where the fine print was written in ancient blood. Now, let's delve into a truly unique and often little-known detail that fueled the belief in restless spirits and potentially walking dead, the ancient practice of secondary burial, or defleshing rituals, in many prehistoric and early historic cultures. This wasn't just about putting a body in the ground and leaving it. In many societies, after the initial burial or exposure, the remains would be exhumed after a period. The bones would then be cleaned, sometimes painted, and reinterred in a more permanent communal ossuary or sacred space. As the pre-dawn light begins to faintly filter through the cracks in your hut, the chilling images begin to recede. The scent of ancient ritual fires fades, replaced by the faint smell of damp earth. But the underlying fear remains the fear that the dead are not entirely at peace, and that there are those among the living who would seek to disturb that peace for their own purposes. The stories of witches and dark arts, of conjured spirits and gruesome rituals, added another terrifying dimension to the belief that the dead walked among us. It was a belief born not just from misunderstanding, but from a profound fascination with the forbidden, a desperate attempt to gain power over the ultimate unknown, even if the price was one's very soul. You close your eyes, glad for the soft hum of your modern fan, pushing away the lingering whisper of ancient incantations. Imagine the scene: a grieving family, months or even a year after the initial burial, returns to the grave. They carefully unearth the remains, and instead of a fully fleshed corpse, they find a partially decomposed body, or perhaps just bones. The act of defleshing, carefully removing any remaining tissue, was a deeply spiritual process, designed to transition the deceased fully from the realm of the living to the realm of the ancestors. To modern eyes, it's gruesome. To them, it was a necessary step. But think about the psychological impact seeing a body in various stages of decay, manipulating the bones. This hands-on, intimate encounter with the decaying process would have reinforced the idea of a spirit leaving the body, but also the lingering physical presence of death. It's like trying to rebuild a Lego set that's been run over by a lawnmower. It's a messy process, and you're always finding unexpected bits. The acrid scent of a phantom ritual fire still seems to linger in the air of your ancient hut, a chilling reminder of those who deliberately sought to command the dead. You've seen how fear and misunderstanding, combined with a touch of human malice, could weave terrifying tales of reanimated corpses and malevolent spirits. But as the centuries slowly turn, a new dawn begins to break, not just over the horizon, but within the human mind itself. A different kind of quest emerges, one driven not by fear of the unknown, but by a burgeoning curiosity to dissect it, to understand it, and perhaps to tame it with the sharp blade of reason. This practice, while intended to properly honor the dead, could also inadvertently fuel fears of the unquiet dead. If the process wasn't done correctly, or if certain taboos were violated, the spirit might not find peace. leading to it lingering or returning. The very act of disturbing the grave, even for ritualistic purposes, carried an inherent risk. It solidified the idea that the dead were connected to their physical remains, and if those remains weren't handled perfectly, the consequences could be dire. You shift on your rough sleeping mat, and this time, the sounds outside are less about eerie whispers and more about the faint, unfamiliar hum of something mechanical, or the distant, earnest murmur of voices engaged in debate, not incantation. The air still feels heavy with history, but a new current is stirring, the first stirrings of systematic inquiry, of what we might cautiously call science. Because even in the dim past, some minds dared to challenge the accepted terrors, to look not to the heavens or the underworld for answers, but to the observable world around them. And let's be honest, trying to explain a ghost with logic back then was probably about as popular as trying to explain NFTs to your grandparents. Good luck with that. And this brings us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Historians and anthropologists still debate whether the widespread ancient belief in the walking dead, from ghosts to proto-vampires, was primarily a psychological coping mechanism for profound grief and trauma. A primitive scientific explanation for misunderstood natural phenomena, or a deliberate social control mechanism used by elites to enforce societal norms and obedience. Was it genuine belief, misinterpretation, or manipulation? For millennia, the unknown was attributed to the supernatural. A mysterious illness? A curse? A strange light in the woods? A spirit? A disembodied voice? A ghost? But gradually, painstakingly, certain individuals began to question these easy answers. They weren't necessarily atheists, many were deeply religious, but they believed that God's creation included understandable laws, and that unraveling these laws was a form of reverence. This was the nascent stage of natural philosophy, the precursor to modern science, where observation, logical deduction, and rudimentary experimentation began to chip away at the monolithic edifice of superstition. Some scholars argue that the idea of the dead returning was a way for ancient societies to process immense loss in an era of high mortality. Imagining a deceased loved one still present, even as a frightening specter, might have been a way to maintain a connection. However terrifying, it was a projection of their own anxieties and sorrows onto the unknown. Others lean towards the primitive science explanation that natural phenomena, decomposition, disease, psychological states like sleep paralysis, or even optical illusions in the dark, were simply misinterpreted through a supernatural lens. If you heard a strange noise in your hut at night, and you believed your recently deceased neighbor was restless, that's the explanation your mind would jump to, rather than, say, a rat. One of the most common historical facts related to this burgeoning skepticism is the development of early anatomical and medical understanding that began to offer physiological explanations for phenomena previously attributed to demonic possession, ghostly visitations, or supernatural curses. As societies moved from simply fearing disease to cautiously attempting to understand the human body, they started to find answers within. A third perspective suggests that fears of the walking dead were leveraged by ruling classes or religious authorities. By promoting fear of restless spirits or vengeful ancestors, they could reinforce social order, emphasize the importance of proper burial rites, which they often controlled, and deter dissent. If a dead person could return to punish transgressions, it certainly made people think twice about challenging authority. It's like telling your kids the boogeyman will get them if they don't clean their room. Except the boogeyman might actually be your great-great-great-great-grandpappy, and he's really annoyed about that unwashed loincloth. Imagine a village gripped by a strange affliction. People are convulsing, speaking in tongues, perhaps even seeming to float or contort unnaturally. To the common person, this was clear demonic possession, but slowly. Medical practitioners, from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates to medieval scholars studying Arabic texts, began to observe these symptoms not as spiritual attacks, but as physical ailments. Epilepsy, for instance, with its dramatic seizures, was frequently mistaken for possession. Mental illnesses, from severe depression to psychosis, manifested in ways that perfectly fit the description of someone tormented by unseen entities. Even conditions like ergotism, caused by consuming contaminated rye, could lead to horrifying hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Surely the work of witches or malevolent spirits, not a fungus on grain. The earliest records and archaeological findings are replete with efforts to either prevent the dead from returning or to appease them if they did. You see examples of bodies buried face down, weighed down with stones, or even dismembered, all in an apparent effort to pin the corpse to the grave and prevent its rising. In other contexts, elaborate offerings of food, drink, or precious items were placed in graves to satisfy the deceased and encourage them to stay peacefully in the afterlife. The fear of an unquiet dead was a powerful motivator for both violence and reverence. These early medical insights, though often incomplete or mixed with folk beliefs, represented a crucial shift. If you could explain the shaking as a fit of the body rather than a demon, it weakened the grip of the supernatural. If a fever and delirium could be linked to something happening inside the body, rather than a vengeful ghost, it brought hope for a cure beyond exorcism. It was the first step towards demystifying the terrifying. It's like when you realize the strange noises in your attic aren't ghosts, but just raccoons having a very enthusiastic dance party. Still annoying, but less existentially terrifying. The darkness of the night presses in around you. You hear a twig snap outside, then silence. Was it an animal or something else in ancient times? Every unexplained sound, every fleeting shadow, every chilling gust of wind was a potential sign of the dead. Without the comforting certainty of science, without the pervasive glow of artificial light, the boundary between this world and the next was constantly porous. The very act of dissection, though taboo for centuries, gradually began to reveal the intricate workings of the human body, providing a material basis for life processes that had once been attributed solely to an animating spirit or soul. When you could see the brain, the nerves, the heart, the organs, it became harder to believe that a disembodied entity was physically manipulating them, or that a corpse could simply reanimate without these complex systems intact. This wasn't about disproving the soul, but about understanding the mechanism of life and death on a physiological level. This fear wasn't a static concept, it evolved. Early beliefs in generalized ghosts or spirits eventually coalesced into more specific entities: the vampire, a reanimated corpse that feeds on the living; the zombie, a reanimated corpse without a soul, often controlled by others, or various forms of malevolent wraiths and specters. Each culture, shaped by its unique environment, beliefs, and experiences, developed its own terrifying variations of the Walking Dead. But the core anxiety remained. What if death isn't the end? And what if what comes back isn't friendly? Now, let's explore a truly unique and often little-known detail about these early attempts to rationalize the supernatural: the fascination with creating ghost-like illusions through early optics, mirrors, and even basic acoustics, which served both as entertainment and as a means to understand how easily human perception could be tricked. Long before elaborate special effects, cunning individuals were using rudimentary science to play with belief. You pull your rough blanket tighter, trying to disappear into the shadows. The chill in the air isn't just the night, it's the weight of millennia of human fear, the ancient terror of the corpse that won't stay buried. The Victorians might have worried about polite society, but your ancient ancestors had much more fundamental concerns. For them, every rustle in the dark, every strange dream, every inexplicable illness could be a sign that someone, or something, had returned from the ultimate beyond. And in this terrifying reality, you are a very small, very vulnerable part of the unfolding drama. Imagine a grand hall or a darkened room in a stately home. A natural philosopher, or perhaps a clever showman, sets up a series of carefully angled mirrors and lenses, or perhaps employs speaking tubes or hidden resonating chambers. By manipulating light and sound, they could create incredibly convincing apparitions, misty figures appearing to float across a stage, disembodied voices whispering from seemingly empty air, or objects appearing to move on their own. The most famous example from a later period, though still rooted in these early principles, is the Pepper's ghost illusion, which utilized large sheets of glass and specific lighting to make spectral figures appear and disappear. Fooling audiences in theaters, you're still there. in that ancient, silent night, pulling the rough blanket around you, the faint chill from the previous chapter still prickling your skin. The idea of the dead rising is no longer an abstract fear from a horror movie. It's a very real, very unsettling possibility that shapes every decision, from how you build your home to how you bury your loved ones. And as you peer into the darkness, you start to understand the terrifying logic behind this ancient dread. It wasn't just imagination. It was often born from unsettling real-world experiences, misinterpreted through the limited scientific lens of the time. While Pepper's ghost became prominent in the Victorian era, the principles behind it, manipulating light, reflection, and sound to create spectral effects, were being explored in much cruder forms centuries earlier. Think of a scholar in a dimly lit chamber projecting a simple image onto a smoke-filled room, or using a primitive speaking tube to create a voice that seems to come from nowhere. These demonstrations, though simple by today's standards, would have been astonishingly convincing to an audience unaccustomed to such visual trickery. Consider the grim reality of death in antiquity. Without modern sanitation, widespread medical knowledge, or advanced diagnostic tools, death was a constant, unpredictable force. Plagues could wipe out entire villages. Famines could claim thousands, and even a simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. Life expectancy was dramatically shorter than today, and few families escaped the pain of losing multiple children. This constant exposure to death, the sheer volume of bodies, and the often rapid onset of decomposition, created a terrifying intimacy with mortality that we can barely fathom today. You're not just seeing death on the news, you're seeing it in your neighbor's hut, your own home, on every corner of your small, vulnerable world. To the rationalists, these illusions served a dual purpose they were entertaining. Yes, but they also offered a tangible explanation for ghosts and spirits. If a human could create such convincing apparitions with simple tools, how many alleged supernatural encounters were simply misinterpretations of natural phenomena or clever deceptions? It was a way of saying, see your mind, or a clever trickster, can fool you just as easily as a real ghost could. It was like showing someone a photoshopped image of a UFO and then revealing the original. Suddenly, the mystery isn't quite so mysterious. One of the most common historical facts that directly fueled the belief in the Walking Dead was the primitive state of medicine and the difficulty in accurately determining death. In ancient times, and even up through the 18th and 19th centuries, there were numerous documented cases of individuals mistakenly pronounced dead and buried alive. Conditions such as catalepsy, a state resembling a trance, with loss of voluntary motion and extreme rigidity, severe comas, narcotic poisoning, hypothermia, or even prolonged fainting spells could lead to a person appearing utterly lifeless. Their breathing might be imperceptible, their pulse faint, and their body cold and stiff. And this leads us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Historians still debate whether the early scientific attempts to debunk supernatural beliefs were primarily driven by a pure pursuit of objective truth, or if they were also influenced by a desire to consolidate power away from religious authorities and mystical practitioners, shifting explanatory authority to a new intellectual elite. Was it purely about uncovering knowledge? Or was there also a power play involved? Imagine the horror your loved one falls ill, grows still and cold. The village elder or local healer pronounces them dead. You mourn, perform the necessary rites, and lay them to rest in the earth. Days later, strange sounds are heard from the grave, a muffled groan, a scratching sound, perhaps even a faint cry. To an ancient mind, this wasn't a medical misdiagnosis. It was undeniable proof that the deceased was struggling to escape, that they were a revenant, a reanimated corpse. The desperate scrabbling of fingernails against the coffin lid, the agonizing realization that you buried someone alive. These real-life tragedies became the horrifying foundational myths of The Walking Dead. It's like when you accidentally bury your keys, and then they suddenly start rattling in the ground. You'd be pretty spooked. Right? Except instead of keys, it's Uncle Theron. Some scholars argue for the pure pursuit of truth. They highlight the genuine intellectual curiosity, the commitment to empirical observation, and the courageous questioning of established dogmas that characterized the early scientific revolution. For these early natural philosophers, Understanding the natural laws governing the universe was an inherently noble pursuit, irrespective of its societal implications. They believed that uncovering the truth, whatever it might be, was the highest calling. This perspective sees science as a progressive force, inherently aimed at dispelling ignorance and superstition for the betterment of humanity. It's like when a child genuinely wants to know how a magic trick works. It's driven purely by curiosity, not by a desire to become a master magician and overthrow the current one. The sheer trauma of these premature burials would have burned deep into the collective consciousness, morphing from isolated incidents into terrifying prophecies. Communities would have shared these chilling tales, reinforcing the belief that the dead could return, not as benevolent spirits, but as tormented entities seeking to escape their earthly prison. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every unexplained whisper in the wind, could then be attributed to these desperate, returning souls. Other scholars argue for a more nuanced interpretation, suggesting that while the pursuit of truth was undoubtedly a factor, the rise of scientific authority also served to challenge and, to some extent, displace the authority of the church and various mystical practitioners like healers, seers, and indeed, necromancers. If science could explain phenomena previously attributed to divine intervention or demonic influence, then the power to interpret the world shifted from priests and witches to scholars and physicians. The ability to prove or disprove the supernatural became a powerful tool in shaping societal narratives and controlling information. By demystifying the world, scientists inadvertently or perhaps consciously carved out a new realm of intellectual dominance. Now let's turn to a truly unique and often little-known detail that intensified fears about the walking dead, the specific practices surrounding ancient burial and excarnation, particularly the often shallow or temporary nature of early graves, and the subsequent interaction communities had with decaying remains. While we touched on secondary burials in the last chapter, let's explore the immediate implications. This perspective doesn't necessarily accuse early scientists of malicious intent, but it acknowledges the social and political consequences of their discoveries. Knowledge is power, and when new knowledge emerges that contradicts old beliefs, it inevitably reshapes the landscape of authority. The scientific explanation became the new gold standard for truth, slowly but surely eroding the credibility of those who claimed unique access to the spiritual realm. In many ancient cultures, especially before the widespread adoption of deeper, more permanent burial methods, bodies might be placed in very shallow graves, rock shelters, or even simply left exposed to the elements for a period. Imagine the scene: a beloved family member has passed. They are laid to rest, perhaps in a simple mound of earth, not far from the living settlement. Over time, weather, animals, or even the natural processes of decomposition could cause the grave to be disturbed. The air in your hut now feels less oppressive, more charged with possibility. You can almost hear the faint scratch of quill on parchment as scholars record observations, the soft clink of glass in a rudimentary laboratory, the earnest voices of men debating the nature of reality. The transition was slow, almost imperceptible over centuries, but it was profoundly impactful. The focus began to shift from appeasing unseen forces to understanding them, from fearing the inexplicable to trying to explain it. Picture it: a heavy rainstorm washes away the topsoil, partially exposing the corpse, or scavenging animals, drawn by the scent, might dig at the grave, leaving behind disturbing evidence of their activity. To someone lacking forensic knowledge, seeing a partially exposed, decaying body, perhaps with limbs in unnatural positions due to animal activity or shifting earth, would not be interpreted as natural processes. Instead, it would be seen as the deceased attempting to claw their way out, struggling against their bonds, or even consuming their own grave clothes. This wasn't just a fleeting glance, it was a close, intimate, and often horrifying encounter with the raw reality of post-mortem decay. It was like finding your house keys after they've been run over by a lawnmower, and they're covered in grass and something else. Very unsettling. This early embrace of a more rational worldview wasn't a sudden, complete victory over superstition. Far from it. Beliefs in ghosts, demons, and other supernatural entities persisted, often adapting and evolving alongside scientific advancements. People might accept that epilepsy was a physical ailment, but still believe that a demon caused the ailment. Or they might understand optical illusions, but still feel a profound dread when alone in a graveyard at night. The human mind is a complex place, capable of holding seemingly contradictory beliefs simultaneously. It's like knowing how a movie is made, but still getting scared during a jump scare. The knowledge is there, but the primal reaction still kicks in. These frequent, unavoidable encounters with disturbed or decaying bodies would have strongly reinforced the idea of a restless dead. If a grave was found disturbed, it wasn't just poor maintenance, it was a proof that the deceased was unquiet. This created a feedback loop. The belief in the walking dead led to specific burial practices to prevent them. And when those practices failed due to natural processes, it simply confirmed the original fear. But the seed of doubt, the spark of rational inquiry, had been planted. Each new medical discovery, each successful debunking of an alleged ghostly phenomenon, each step towards understanding the natural world, chipped away at the certainty that the dead walked among us in a malevolent, supernatural way. The horrors weren't necessarily gone, but they were beginning to be recategorized, moved from the realm of divine wrath to the realm of human physiology, psychology, or even trickery. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, into a time when the darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a living, breathing thing, full of unseen horrors. Imagine yourself in a world without streetlights, without flashlights, without even a match to strike. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the world became an inky black canvas, punctuated only by the distant howls of wild animals, the creak of unseen branches, and the terrifying rustle of something just out of sight. This was a world where fear wasn't just a fleeting emotion, it was a constant companion, especially when it came to the ultimate unknown death. And in the vast, inky blackness of ancient nights, people didn't just fear the dead, they truly believed the dead walked among them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop your current location and local time in the comments. It's always wild to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You watch as the first faint rays of actual dawn pierce through the cracks in your hut, painting stripes of dim light across the dirt floor. The shadows, which had seemed so menacing in the deep night, now begin to shrink, to lose their power. The unseen forces of the past are slowly being brought into the light, examined, and, in some cases, explained away. It's a long, arduous process, full of setbacks and continued fears, but the journey towards understanding had begun. The raw terror of the unexplainable was slowly, painfully, being confronted by the burgeoning light of reason. And as you drift deeper into comfort, you can almost hear the distant, quiet hum of a scientific revolution, slowly but surely trying to make sense of a haunted world. And this leads us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Historians and archaeologists still debate whether the widespread archaeological evidence of deviant burials, bodies buried face down, decapitated, staked, or with rocks in their mouths in ancient contexts, primarily represents fear-driven attempts to physically immobilize the dead, or if such practices were more often symbolic rituals intended to transform or transition the deceased spirit, reflecting complex beliefs about the afterlife rather than simple dread of revenants. Were they literally trying to nail the dead into their graves? Or was it a deeper, ritualistic gesture? The faint light of the dawning day has finally crept into your ancient hut, chasing away the deepest shadows, the ones that seem to hold the echoes of necromancers and the specters of early scientific debunkings. You've seen how medical understandings began to explain away some physical manifestations of the supernatural, and how clever showmen could trick the eye and ear with mirrors and pipes. But what if the source of the haunting wasn't external? Not a reanimated corpse, not a conjured spirit, and not even a clever trick. What if the ghosts that people swore they saw, the voices they heard, and the cold spots they felt were not in the world around them, but within their own minds? Some scholars argue for the literal interpretation that these burials, particularly those with signs of extreme violence or restraint, were direct, desperate attempts to prevent a feared corpse from rising. If you bury someone face down, it's believed they'll dig down into the earth rather than up towards the surface. Staking a body or placing stones in the mouth was thought to prevent them from feeding or speaking. This suggests a very real physical fear of the dead returning to harm the living. It's like putting a really heavy rock on your recycling bin to stop raccoons. It's a practical solution to a perceived problem. You roll over on your mat, still feeling the chill of the early morning. But now it's a mental chill, a creeping realization. The world outside might be settling into a predictable rhythm, but the world inside the human skull remains a swirling, complex landscape of perception, memory, and emotion. Because as science began to explain the body, it also started to peek into the mind. And what it found there was just as capable of creating terrifying illusions as any ancient curse. And let's be honest, sometimes your own brain is weirder than any ghost story. Have you ever tried to remember where you put your keys after a long day? That's its own kind of haunting. Other scholars argue that these deviant burials are far more nuanced. They suggest that practices like decapitation or dismemberment, while seemingly violent, could have been part of complex ritualistic processes designed to ensure the proper transition of the soul, or to prevent a spirit from returning, rather than the physical body. It's about ensuring the deceased moved on to the next realm, or perhaps joining the ancestors in a specific way, even if that involved unusual treatment of the corpse. The meaning might have been symbolic of breaking the link to the living world, rather than literally pinning a zombie. It's like sending someone off with a really complicated farewell ritual, just to make sure they really leave. For centuries, any unusual sensory experience, a fleeting shadow, a strange sound, a sudden feeling of being watched, if it couldn't be immediately explained by a known physical cause, was quickly attributed to the supernatural. This was particularly true in times of stress, grief, or darkness, when the human mind is already primed to seek meaning in ambiguity. But as understanding of human psychology, however rudimentary, began to grow, so too did the awareness that our own brains are incredibly powerful, and sometimes incredibly unreliable, interpreters of reality. This academic debate highlights the complexity of interpreting ancient practices from a modern perspective. We see the physical evidence, but the underlying intentions and beliefs are often lost to time, leaving us to piece together a puzzle with many missing pieces. Was it terror of the reanimated corpse, or intricate spiritual doctrine, perhaps? As often happens, it was a blend of both, where physical actions carried deep spiritual significance. One of the most common historical facts that accounts for many perceived supernatural phenomena is the human brain's tendency to create patterns and meaning from ambiguous stimuli. A phenomenon known as pareidolia for visual and apophenia for auditory or other sensory patterns. Your brain is a masterful storyteller, and when it doesn't have enough information, it will happily invent it. The understanding, or rather the misunderstanding, of decomposition also played a massive role. You're in a world without refrigerators, without embalming. A body left even for a short time would begin to change. The putrefaction process, the bloating caused by gases, the purging of fluids from orifices, the sounds of internal gases escaping, all these natural phenomena would have been incredibly disturbing and easily interpreted as signs of the body reanimating, groaning, or expelling its last breaths. A body might swell in its coffin, seeming to grow or appear to shift. These sights and sounds, perfectly natural to a modern pathologist, would have been undeniable evidence of the deceased struggling, moving, or even feeding to an ancient observer. Imagine you're walking alone at night, or perhaps you're in a dimly lit, unfamiliar room. The shadows are long and dancing, stirred by an unseen breeze. You glimpse a shape in the corner of your eye, a coat draped over a chair, or a pile of laundry. But for a split second, your brain's pattern recognition system, honed over millennia to spot predators or friends in the wilderness, sees a human form. Perhaps it's the silhouette of a standing figure, or a face peering out from the folds of fabric. For that instant, you perceive a ghost. Only when you blink or turn your head fully does your rational mind correct the illusion. Oh, it's just a coat. But the initial fear, the visceral reaction, has already occurred. Beyond the physical body, the psychological impact of grief in communities without robust mental health support systems cannot be overstated. When you lose someone profoundly, your mind often plays tricks. dreams of the deceased, vivid memories, auditory hallucinations hearing their voice, or even the psychological phenomenon of seeing a lost loved one in a crowd are common parts of the grieving process. In a world where the supernatural was the primary explanation for the unexplained, these very real psychological experiences would have been immediately interpreted as genuine visitations from the dead. You're desperate to see them, and your mind might just oblige, creating a powerful, albeit internal, proof of their lingering presence. It's like when you're really craving ice cream, and suddenly every cloud looks like a giant scoop. This isn't unique to visual input. Auditory pareidolia is just as common. The creaking of an old house, the wind whistling through a chimney, the distant whine of a dog. Your brain, eager to find meaning, might interpret these as whispers, groans, or even a disembodied voice calling your name. The low-frequency vibrations known as infrasound, often produced by natural phenomena like strong winds, distant storms, or even machinery, can also have a profound and unsettling effect on humans. While largely inaudible, infrasound can cause feelings of unease, dread, anxiety, or even visual distortions in peripheral vision due to its effect on the eyeball's resonance. Imagine sitting in a supposedly haunted building, unknowingly exposed to infrasound, and suddenly feeling overwhelmed by inexplicable terror, seeing shadowy movements at the edge of your sight. To someone in the past, this wasn't science, this was a ghost, a presence, a demonic force. It's like when you hear your name called in a crowded room, but it turns out someone just sneezed really loud. Your brain wanted it to be important. The dark presses in again, and you find yourself imagining the deep, cold earth, a body lying beneath, perhaps not quite at peace. The sounds outside your hut intensify slightly. Is that the wind? Or something scraping? You pull your blanket tighter, the ancient fears seeping into your contemporary comfort. The historical distance fades, and you feel a shiver that has nothing to do with the temperature. You begin to understand, on a visceral level, why people in these unenlightened, terrifying times truly believe that the dead walked among them, lurking in the shadows, scratching at the earth, or whispering on the wind. It wasn't just a story, it was their reality. These misinterpretations are compounded by the psychological state of the individual. If you are already fearful, grieving, tired, or primed to believe in ghosts, your brain is even more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli in a supernatural way. Your subconscious biases act like a filter, highlighting anything that supports your existing beliefs. The last faint echo of a scratching sound outside your ancient hut fades, leaving you with the unsettling image of a restless corpse trapped between worlds. But the fear of the dead wasn't just about misinterpreted medical conditions or disturbed graves. It was about the stories, the narratives passed down through generations, transforming raw fear into terrifying, tangible entities. You're still wrapped in that rough blanket, in that deep, primordial night. But now, the shadows around you begin to coalesce into shapes, into forms that have haunted humanity for millennia. These aren't just the vaguely unquiet dead. These are the specific, monstrous forms that rose from the grave to terrorize the living. Now, let's explore a truly unique and often little-known detail that profoundly influenced people's perceptions of the dead, walking among us the physiological effects of sleep paralysis and hypnopompic hallucinations. These are incredibly common, but often terrifying. Experiences that bridge the gap between wakefulness and sleep, leading to vivid, often frightening, perceptions that feel utterly real. You feel a subtle shift in the air, a drop in temperature that has nothing to do with the outside climate. It's the kind of chill that creeps up your spine, whispers in your ear, and makes the hair on your arms stand on end. This is the realm of the revenant, the zombie, the ghoul, the creatures of nightmare born from ancient fears and given shape by human imagination. And frankly, given their historical track record, you're probably better off staying under that blanket and pretending you're just having a very vivid dream. Imagine this: you've just woken up, or you're just drifting off to sleep. Your mind is conscious, but your body is still in a state of muscle paralysis, which normally prevents you from acting out your dreams. This is sleep paralysis. You try to move, to shout, but you can't. You are utterly, terrifyingly immobile. And then the hallucinations begin. these aren't just vague shadows. People describe seeing dark figures standing over them, shadowy presences at the foot of their bed, hearing whispers or growls, feeling pressure on their chest, the old hag phenomenon, or even the sensation of being dragged or levitated. The concept of a reanimated corpse, a body returned from the grave without its soul or with a malevolent one, is perhaps one of the most enduring and terrifying myths across cultures. While the modern zombie might be a relatively recent pop culture phenomenon, the underlying fear of a corpse walking again is as old as death itself. These weren't just spirits, these were physical threats, often hungry, often contagious, always terrifying. For someone in the ancient world, or even in later periods without modern neurological understanding, experiencing sleep paralysis with its accompanying hallucinations would have been undeniable proof of a nocturnal visitor, a ghost, a demon, a succubus, or a malevolent spirit pressing down on them. The inability to move or cry out would only confirm that they were utterly at the mercy of this unseen entity. There was no medical explanation, no understanding of REM sleep and its paralysis. There was only the terrifying, vivid reality of a physical attack by a supernatural being. It's like waking up to find your cat sitting on your chest, but instead of purring, it's whispering ancient curses and you can't push it off. Horrifying. One of the most common historical facts that underpins these myths is the widespread belief in ancient and medieval times that certain deceased individuals, particularly those who died violently, unexpectedly, or were considered unclean or malevolent in life, were more prone to returning as physically active revenants. It wasn't just anyone who came back. There was often a reason. If someone died a sudden, brutal death, their spirit might not find peace. If they were a wicked person in life, their evil might cling to their corpse. If they were shunned by the community or died without proper burial rites, their restless spirit might seek vengeance. These experiences, because they are so vivid and feel so real, would have been recounted with utter conviction, adding to the communal pool of evidence that the dead walked among them, particularly at night. The similarity of descriptions across cultures and centuries, before easy communication, suggests a common underlying physiological phenomenon, interpreted through different cultural lenses. It highlights how the brain, under specific conditions, can create a reality that is utterly convincing, even if it's entirely internal. Imagine a world without forensic pathology. If a person died violently, say from a sudden illness that left marks on their body, or from an accident, the cause might not be clear. If their body was found in an unusual state, perhaps bloated from decomposition, or with signs of struggle from premature burial, it would be attributed to the supernatural, not the natural. A person who died of a wasting disease might be thought to be consuming themselves in the grave, a proto-vampiric sign. The circumstances of death often dictated the type of monster a person became. It's like a medieval version of Rate My Villain, where the criteria are entirely based on how awful your demise was. And this leads us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Psychologists and cultural anthropologists still debate whether the human brain is predisposed to supernatural belief due to inherent cognitive biases, such as agency detection or theory of mind, or if belief in the dead walking among us is primarily a culturally constructed phenomenon, shaped by narrative, ritual, and social reinforcement. Is it something hardwired into our minds, or something we learn? These beliefs led to specific superstitions and practices aimed at preventing the unquiet dead from rising. You'd find tales of villagers digging up graves to stake corpses through the heart, or decapitating bodies to sever the link between the head and presumably the mind or spirit and the body. Sometimes, people would stuff poppies or garlic in the mouth of the deceased, or even place coins, believing these would keep the spirit from returning or feeding. It was a desperate, often gruesome attempt to ensure peace, both for the living and for the dead. Some scholars argue for the cognitive bias perspective. They propose that humans have an evolutionary tendency to overdetect agency in the environment, to assume that sounds or movements are caused by a living being, even when they're not. This hyperactive agency detection device was crucial for survival. Better to assume a rustle in the bushes is a predator than to ignore it. In a world lacking scientific explanations, this bias extends to the inexplicable. A strange cold spot must be a presence, a flicker of light must be a spirit. Furthermore, our inherent theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, desires, intentions, to others can easily be extended to the deceased, imagining their consciousness persisting after death. This view suggests that belief in ghosts is a natural byproduct of how our brains are built. It's like how you're always convinced the check engine light means imminent doom, even when it's just a loose gas cap. Our brains lean towards the dramatic. Now, let's explore a truly unique and often little-known detail that contributed to the specific folklore of reanimated corpses, the ancient and medieval understanding or misunderstanding of the human digestive system, and the process of putrefaction, particularly in colder climates or in cases of embalming attempts. While we touched on general decomposition, this goes a step further into the macabre. Other scholars emphasize the cultural construction argument. They contend that while cognitive biases might provide a readiness for supernatural belief, the specific forms that belief takes, whether it's vengeful ghosts, benevolent ancestors, or wandering zombies, are heavily influenced by cultural narratives, religious doctrines, and social learning. Children are told ghost stories, participate in mourning rituals, and witness their elders' reactions to unexplained phenomena. These narratives provide the framework through which ambiguous sensory experiences are interpreted. If your culture tells you that a deceased loved one might return as a protective spirit, a feeling of presence might be comforting. If your culture tells you the dead are restless, the same feeling might be terrifying. This view suggests that while our brains might be wired to look for patterns, culture provides the patterns. In some historical accounts, particularly from Eastern Europe, there are mentions of bodies found in graves with fresh blood around the mouth, or appearing plump or undecayed long after death. To a modern eye, this can often be explained by various factors. The debate highlights the complex interplay between our innate cognitive architecture and the social environment in which we develop. It's likely a combination of both. Our brains provide the fertile ground for supernatural belief, but culture dictates which seeds are sown and which terrifying blossoms bloom. Gas buildup. As a body decomposes, gases build up internally. This pressure can force blood-tinged fluids from the mouth or nose, especially when the grave is disturbed. To an ancient mind, this wasn't gas, it was the corpse feeding, or having just fed. As you awaken more fully, the faint light strengthening outside your hut, you realize how profoundly susceptible the human mind is to suggestion, to fear, and to its own internal workings. A creak in the night, a fleeting shadow, a vivid dream, all could be twisted into terrifying proof of the dead walking among us. The lack of understanding about neurology, psychology, and even basic sensory perception meant that people's own minds became the most convincing theaters for ghostly dramas. Casing effect. In very cold or dry conditions, or if the burial environment was particularly anaerobic, lack of oxygen, decomposition can be significantly slowed. Sometimes a protective layer, almost like a natural saponification or adipocare grave wax formation, can encase the internal organs, making the body appear remarkably well preserved for a time. When opened, it would seem fresh. Think about the power of suggestion and collective belief. If one person in a community genuinely believes they saw a ghost, and they tell their story with conviction, it primes others. Their own ambiguous experiences might then be interpreted through this new lens. Soon, everyone is seeing or hearing things, caught in a shared delusion, a consensual hallucination. This isn't necessarily a malicious trick, it's a powerful psychological cascade. It's like when one person yawns and suddenly everyone else in the room is yawning too. Contagious, but with more screaming. Post-mortem digestion. In rare cases, if a person died shortly after a meal, the digestive enzymes within their stomach and intestines would continue to break down food after death. If the body was exhumed soon after, the contents of the digestive tract, appearing as partially digested food or even a brownish liquid, could be misinterpreted as evidence of the corpse having eaten something after burial. The effects of loneliness and isolation, common in many historical settings, also play a significant role. Prolonged sensory deprivation or extreme emotional distress can lead to hallucinations, disorienting perceptions, and a blurring of the line between reality and imagination. A lonely shepherd, a reclusive hermit, a sailor lost at sea, their minds, starved of normal stimuli, might create companions, voices or visions that feel utterly real, interpreted as spirits reaching out from beyond. Imagine the absolute terror of a community exhuming a body believed to be a revenant, only to find a corpse that looks disturbingly fresh, perhaps with a bloody residue around its mouth. This wasn't just a sign of being unquiet, it was proof of actively feeding, or even being alive. This misinterpretation of natural, albeit gruesome, biological processes directly fed into the most horrifying aspects of vampire and ghoul folklore. It's like opening a can of forgotten food in the back of your fridge, and instead of just mold, it looks like it's actively trying to eat you. Far less appetizing, even seemingly mundane aspects of human life could contribute. The quality of sleep, the effects of diet or lack thereof, the presence of underlying undiagnosed mental health conditions. All these factors could create a fertile ground for perceiving the supernatural. A person suffering from severe depression might interpret their pervasive sadness as the oppressive presence of a dark entity. Someone experiencing early dementia might describe interactions with deceased loved ones as if they were truly present. These were not understood as medical conditions then, but as spiritual afflictions. These misinterpreted signs became the foundation for specific countermeasures. If the body was found fresh, it needed to be destroyed. If it had eaten, its means of eating had to be removed. These beliefs created a horrifying cycle of exhumation and desecration, all driven by a desperate, terrified misunderstanding of the post-mortem journey. The stories of hauntings, the perceived presence of the dead, were thus not just external phenomena, but often profound internal experiences. The ancient world, without the tools to understand its own psychological landscape, was constantly haunted by the projections of its own fears, its own grief, and the strange, often terrifying, workings of the human mind itself. You feel the soft fabric of your modern blanket, a reminder of a world that, for all its complexities, has at least begun to unravel some of the mysteries that once kept humanity shivering in fear of its own shadows. And as you finally drift, you can almost hear the soft, rhythmic hum of your own brain, forever creating, forever interpreting, and sometimes forever haunting itself. And this leads us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Historians and folklorists still debate whether the detailed, often gruesome descriptions of reanimated corpses, from the bloating of the revenant to the blood around the vampire's mouth in ancient and medieval texts, were primarily literal interpretations of misunderstood decomposition, or if they served as powerful allegories for societal anxieties like plague, famine, and the fear of the other within a community. Were they trying to describe what they actually saw? Or were they using these monsters as metaphors for much deeper societal fears? The subtle hum of your modern fan is a comforting counterpoint to the lingering thoughts of the human mind's capacity for illusion, a theme we explored in our last chapter. You've seen how our own brains, with their pareidolia and sleep paralysis, can conjure terrifying phantoms from thin air. But what happens when that internal landscape of fear and belief spills out into the rituals of society, shaping the very way we interact with the death itself tonight? We step from the haunted mind into the eerie customs of the ancient and not-so-ancient world, where the fear that the dead walked among us was woven directly into the fabric of burial and mourning. Some scholars argue for the literal interpretation, or at least a highly influenced one, that the direct, horrifying experiences with improperly buried or partially decomposed bodies, combined with the lack of scientific explanation, led people to describe what they witnessed as clear signs of a malevolent, reanimated entity. The swollen corpse was clearly feeding. The fresh appearance was proof it hadn't truly died. This viewpoint emphasizes the empirical, albeit flawed. Observations of the time, it's like when you see a really bizarre cloud formation and immediately decide it's a flying saucer, because that's the only way your brain can process it. You stir on your rough sleeping mat, the faint light of the true dawn now painting the interior of your hut with clear, undeniable lines. But the chill you feel isn't from the fading night. It's the spectral touch of practices born from profound dread. Imagine living in a time when death was not just an emotional tragedy, but a palpable physical threat that could seemingly rise from the grave. Because how a society treats its dead says a lot about what it truly believes about the afterlife. And sometimes, those beliefs necessitated some truly bizarre and, frankly, unsettling procedures. And let's be honest, if you thought planning a modern funeral was stressful, try doing it knowing the deceased might just come back for a casual stroll. Talk about an unexpected guest. Other scholars argue that while decomposition played a role, the precise characteristics of monsters like vampires and zombies were heavily influenced by deeper societal anxieties. The vampire, for instance, often preyed on the living, draining their life force, mirroring the fear of plagues that inexplicably drained the life from communities. The unclean nature of some revenants might reflect anxieties about social outcasts or those who challenged communal norms. The act of spreading the curse seen in many vampire and zombie myths could be an allegory for the rapid, terrifying spread of infectious diseases. These monsters became a convenient, tangible form for otherwise abstract terrors like starvation, pestilence, and social breakdown. For much of history, before modern medical science and the definitive pronouncement of death, there was a pervasive, gnawing fear, the fear of being buried alive. This is one of the most common historical facts that directly fueled beliefs about the dead walking or returning. Without stethoscopes, EKGs, or any reliable way to detect faint heartbeats or respiration, people who had fallen into deep comas, catatonic states, or who suffered from conditions like catalepsy could easily be mistaken for dead. The night deepens around you and the images become more vivid, more unsettling. You imagine the faint, earthy smell of a disturbed grave, the cloying sweetness of decay. You hear the whispers of desperate villagers, convinced that their neighbor, just buried, is now scratching at the earth, hungering for life. This was the terrifying reality of life before microbiology, before forensic science, before even simple refrigeration. Imagine the horror you're sick, gravely ill, perhaps slipping in and out of consciousness. You wake to the terrifying sensation of being enclosed, of dirt pressing down, of the absolute claustrophobic darkness of a coffin. This was not merely a hypothetical fear. Historical accounts, though often sensationalized, suggest that cases of premature burial, or at least the fear of it, were disturbingly common. People would wake up in their graves, or their bodies would be found in unusual positions upon exhumation, sparking chilling local legends of the dead attempting to escape. The fear of the dead walking wasn't just a passive belief. It led to active, often brutal measures. Exhumation wasn't just an archaeological curiosity. It was a desperate act of communal self-preservation. Tales abound from various cultures of vampire burials or anti-revenant measures. This terror led to various preventative measures, some mundane, some macabre. People would devise special safety coffins equipped with bells, flags, or even breathing tubes, allowing those mistakenly interred to signal for help. Families might maintain a prolonged death watch over the deceased for days, hoping for any sign of life, no matter how faint. The body might even be deliberately injured, a cut, a poke, a pinch, to see if there was any reaction. While these measures were born of a rational fear of being buried alive, they inadvertently reinforced the idea that the dead were not always truly dead, but merely resting, capable of waking and perhaps walking right out of their untimely tombs. It was like a very, very high-stakes alarm clock, except instead of waking up to coffee, you woke up to dirt in your mouth. Decapitation. The head would be severed from the body and often placed between the legs or at the feet, or even buried separately, to prevent the corpse from being able to see or find its way back to the living. Staking a wooden or iron stake driven through the heart or chest was a common method to pin the corpse to its grave, preventing it from rising. Mouth-stuffing stones, bricks, or even garlic, which was believed to repel evil, were sometimes placed in the mouth of the deceased, thought to prevent them from feeding or speaking malevolent curses. Imagine uncovering an ancient grave, and instead of finding a body respectfully laid to rest, you find a skeleton with a brick shoved in its mouth, or one that has been decapitated, or even one with large stones placed over its limbs, or buried face down. These weren't isolated incidents. Archaeological sites across Europe, from medieval Bulgaria to Poland and Italy, have yielded fascinating and chilling examples of such burials. Ankles bound or bodies face down. The feet might be tied together or the body buried face down. forcing the revenant to dig down into the earth rather than up towards the surface if it tried to rise. The thinking behind these practices was often rooted in the belief that certain individuals, those who died suddenly or violently, those with strange physical characteristics, or those who were simply disliked in life, were particularly prone to returning from the grave as malevolent spirits. Vampires, or revenants' reanimated corpses, these acts, born from sheer terror, created a grim tableau in ancient cemeteries. Imagine the despair and determination required to unearth a beloved family member, now feared as a monster, and perform such horrific acts upon their remains. It was a testament to the power of their belief and the depth of their fear. It's like trying to child-proof your house. But the child is a reanimated corpse, and the proofs involve blunt instruments, stones or bricks in the mouth. This was believed to prevent the vampire from feeding or spreading plague through biting. It was like putting a very permanent muzzle on a very undead dog. Even the phenomenon of sleep paralysis might have contributed to these myths. You wake up, paralyzed, unable to move, feeling a heavy weight on your chest, seeing shadowy figures in the room. In modern times, we understand this as a neurological glitch. In ancient times, it was undeniable proof of a malevolent spirit or even a returning corpse pressing down on you, trying to steal your breath or your soul. These terrifying nocturnal experiences would have added to the evidence that the dead were indeed among the living, lurking in the shadows of the night. Decapitation, cutting off the head, was seen as a definitive way to sever the spirit's connection to the body, rendering it incapable of movement or action. The subtle sounds of your own modern home seem to amplify in the quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of a car, the gentle sigh of the wind for a moment. You almost interpret them as the creaks of a coffin, the moans of a revenant, the scratching of desperate fingers against wood. The ancient world's terror was potent, fueled by a perfect storm of medical ignorance, natural decay, psychological phenomena, and the desperate human need to explain the inexplicable. Staking through the heart or body, much like the popular vampire lore. Driving a stake, often of wood or iron, through the chest was believed to pin the reanimated corpse to the ground, preventing it from rising. You pull your blanket tighter. The images of reanimated corpses, of desperate, ancient rituals, swirling in your mind. The darkness outside your window no longer feels entirely safe. The line between sleep and wakefulness blurs. And for a fleeting moment, you wonder if you're truly alone in the room, or if a very old, very hungry shadow is just out of sight, drawn by the stillness of the night. Their reality, though distant in time, still casts a long, chilling shadow, burying face down. The idea here was that if the dead did try to rise, they would dig down, further into the earth, rather than up and out of the grave. It was a macabre form of spiritual misdirection. The chill from the previous night still clings to you, a ghostly presence in the ancient darkness. You've considered the physical realities and the psychological terrors that convinced people the dead could rise. But now, the amorphous fear of a general revenant begins to sharpen, to take on a terrifyingly specific form, the vampire. Forget the sparkling creatures of modern fiction. The historical vampire was a truly grotesque, visceral horror. A creature born from disease, decay, and desperate misunderstanding. And tonight, you're going deep into the folklore that haunted entire villages, leading to acts of gruesome desperation, placing heavy stones or large rocks over the body similar to staking. This was a physical restraint, ensuring the corpse couldn't push its way out of the grave. You're back in that primitive hut, the rough blanket your only comfort. But the sounds outside are different now. Less like scratching, more like a faint, wet sucking sound, or perhaps the distant, desperate cough of someone wasting away. The air feels heavy, sickly sweet, like stagnant blood. You instinctively pull your hand closer to your chest, checking for a pulse, for the warmth of your own living blood. Because in this chilling reality, the greatest fear isn't just that the dead walk, but that they walk to feed on the living. And if you think a bad online dating experience is a drain on your energy, imagine an actual vampire. That's a whole different kind of ghosting. These were not gentle acts of mourning. They were acts of desperate, tangible fear. They reveal a society that wasn't just theorizing about the dead walking. They believed it was a very real possibility, and they were willing to go to extreme, grisly lengths to stop it. This wasn't about respecting the deceased, it was about protecting the living. The very existence of these deviant burials speaks volumes about the pervasive, visceral terror of the reanimated dead, long before Hollywood ever put a zombie on screen. The fear of the vampire, a reanimated corpse that preys on the living by draining their blood or life force, is one of the most pervasive and terrifying myths in human history. Particularly prevalent in Eastern European folklore, it wasn't a singular universal myth, but a collection of regional beliefs that shared common elements. The deceased was somehow unquiet, returned to cause harm, and often associated with a grisly feast on the living. And this brings us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Historians and archaeologists still debate whether these deviant burials were primarily reactive measures against existing fears and beliefs. In revenants, vampires, meaning the belief came first, then the action oskoi, or if the rituals themselves, by their very performance and visibility, serve to reinforce and even create these specific supernatural beliefs within a community. Is it chicken or egg? Did the fear drive the practice, or did the practice deepen the fear? One of the most common historical facts that fueled the vampire myth was the misinterpretation of advanced stages of decomposition, particularly bloating and the purging of internal fluids from bodily orifices. As we briefly touched upon before, this requires a deeper dive. When a body decomposes, bacteria inside the gut produce gases. These gases cause the abdomen to swell, distending the corpse. The pressure can then force blood-tinged fluids known as purge fluid from the mouth, nose, or other openings. To an ancient, terrified villager, exhuming a body believed to be a vampire, these signs were undeniable proof the swollen belly meant it had recently fed on blood, and the bloody discharge from the mouth meant it was still feasting or had just finished its gruesome meal. Some scholars argue that these practices were a direct response to a pre-existing belief system. In this view, communities already had vivid folklore about vampires or restless dead. When unexplained deaths occurred, especially during plagues or times of great stress, or when bodies showed signs of post-mortem change that were misinterpreted as continued activity. These existing beliefs provided a framework for explanation. The deviant burials were then the logical, protective steps taken to combat a known threat. The community would stake a corpse because they believed it was a vampire. This perspective emphasizes the continuity of folklore and superstition, guiding practical action. It's like installing a really expensive security system because you already believe your neighbor is stealing your garden gnomes. Imagine the scene: a small community is being plagued by a mysterious illness, a wasting sickness where people grow pale, weak, and eventually die. They suspect a vampire. They dig up a recently deceased person, perhaps one who died suddenly or suspiciously. They pull back the shroud, and there it is, a body with a distended, taut belly, and a dark, reddish liquid staining its lips and chin. The smell would have been overpowering, the sweet, sickening odor of putrefaction. To them, this wasn't natural. It was a demonic sign, proof of the undead feeding in the night. This visceral evidence, combined with the lack of scientific understanding, cemented the vampire's reality. It's like opening a can of over-fermented sauerkraut and thinking it's alive and plotting your demise. Other scholars propose a more reciprocal relationship, suggesting that the rituals themselves played a crucial role in solidifying and transmitting the beliefs. When a community collectively engages in the gruesome act of staking a corpse or putting a brick in its mouth, it's a powerful public performance. Witnessing such an act, or hearing about it from a trusted source, could deeply embed the idea that such extreme measures are necessary, and therefore the threat they are preventing must be very real. The ritual itself becomes a form of proof for the belief. The sight of a disinterred corpse being decapitated would leave an indelible mark on the collective consciousness, reinforcing the terrifying notion of the walking dead. This perspective suggests that fear isn't just born from belief, but can be manufactured and amplified by the very acts intended to combat it. It's like if everyone started wearing tin-foil hats, you might eventually wonder if there really are mind-reading aliens, even if you didn't believe it before. This terrifying phenomenon would be discussed in hushed, fearful tones, passed from village to village, solidifying the image of the blood-swollen corpse as the true mark of a vampire. It didn't matter that it was a natural process. In a world without scientific explanation, it was the ultimate horror. This debate highlights the complex interplay between human psychology, cultural narratives, and practical responses to the inexplicable. It's likely that both aspects were at play. Feeding into a terrifying feedback loop, existing fears were confirmed by perceived anomalies, leading to extreme burial practices, which in turn reinforced the very fears they sought to mitigate. Now, let's explore a truly unique and often little-known detail that added another layer of chilling proof to the vampire legend: the post-mortem growth of hair and nails, and the shrunken appearance of the skin around them. When a person dies, their skin dehydrates and shrinks. This shrinkage, particularly around the nail beds and hair follicles, can give the illusion that the nails and hair have grown longer or thicker after death. They haven't actually grown. Of course, it's simply that the skin has receded, making them appear more prominent. As you absorb the implications of these ancient funeral customs, you realize how fundamentally different the experience of death was in the past. It wasn't just a private sorrow, it was often a public anxiety, a potential communal threat. The dying process, the moments after death, and the rituals of burial were fraught with terror, not just of losing a loved one, but of that loved one returning as something monstrous. The need for definitive, reassuring closure was paramount, and when that was threatened by ambiguous signs of life, or by the natural, unsettling process of decay, societies reacted with desperate, often violent measures. Imagine the horror again you exhume a suspected vampire. You've seen the bloated stomach and the bloody mouth. But then, as you look closer, you see the fingernails seem longer, perhaps curled, and the hair on the head or face appears to have sprouted or become more dense. To the terrified villagers, this wasn't an optical illusion caused by dehydration. It was undeniable proof that the creature was still living in some macabre way, its bodily functions continuing even in the grave, its vital essence somehow renewing itself. This apparent growth would have been seen as another horrifying sign that the deceased was not truly dead, but undergoing a dark transformation. It's like finding a plant that's supposed to be dead suddenly sprouting new leaves. But instead of pleasant, it's proof that it's now going to steal your soul. Think about the sheer emotional weight of these practices. A family grieving a loved one, forced to consider mutilating the body to prevent its reanimation. The constant vigilance for signs of movement in the coffin. The dread of a misplaced bell. These customs weren't born of malice, but of a profound and understandable terror in the face of the unknown. They underscore just how real the belief in the dead walking among us was, not as a metaphor, but as a literal, terrifying possibility. This observation would have further fueled the desperate countermeasures. If the body was still growing, it needed to be stopped. If its nails were long, it could claw its way out. These gruesome details became integral to the proof that a vampire was indeed responsible for the mysterious deaths plaguing a community. Even the simple act of a burial, then, was an act of profound hope and fear. Hope that the deceased would find peace, and fear that they wouldn't. The earth pressed down not just as a final resting place, but as a barrier, a shield against the unsettling possibility of a return. And as you imagine the hushed, nervous atmosphere around an ancient grave, the quick, furtive gestures of those ensuring the dead stayed put, you understand just how deeply this fear was ingrained. The finality of death, which we take for granted, was a concept constantly under siege, challenged by ambiguous physiology and reinforced by desperate, often gruesome, ritual. You can almost feel the weight of the freshly turned earth, a heavy blanket intended to keep the restless at bay. And this leads us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Historians and medical anthropologists still debate whether the detailed vampire outbreaks reported in medieval and early modern Eastern Europe were primarily mass psychogenic illnesses or cases of hysteria, or if they represented communities attempting to rationalize and ritualize the devastating impact of actual, unrecognized epidemics like tuberculosis or pellagra through the lens of existing folklore. Were people actually seeing vampires, or were they collectively projecting their fear onto a convenient scapegoat for an invisible killer? The weight of the earth, as we discussed last time, pressed down not just on the bodies of the dead, but on the minds of the living, a physical and psychological barrier against the unsettling thought of their return. You've seen how medical misunderstandings and terrifying burial practices cemented the idea that the deceased might not stay put. But how did these fears, these isolated incidents, these grim rituals, spread beyond a single village or a single family? How did the whisper of a restless spirit in one valley become a chilling cautionary tale in another? Miles and miles away tonight, we delve into the invisible threads of folklore and oral tradition, the ancient internet of fear, where stories of the walking dead were passed from lip to ear, weaving themselves into the very fabric of human belief. Some scholars argue for the psychogenic interpretation that in times of extreme stress, fear, and lack of medical knowledge, communities could experience mass hysteria. A few unexplained deaths, combined with the gruesome findings during exhumations, misinterpreted decomposition, could trigger a panic. People might genuinely believe they saw a vampire or experienced its attack, leading to a cascade of similar sightings and anxieties throughout the community. This view emphasizes the power of collective belief and fear to manifest perceived reality. It's like when everyone in the office gets convinced they have the office bug, even if it's just a common cold. Because one person sneezed really loudly, you're no longer in a solitary hut. You're huddled close to a flickering fire in a communal longhouse, or perhaps sitting on a rough bench in a smoky medieval tavern. The wind howls outside, rattling the windows, mimicking the cries of unseen things. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and perhaps a faint scent of fear. Faces are illuminated by the dancing flames, eyes wide, fixed on the elder, the bard, or simply the best storyteller in the room. Because in a world without books, without newspapers, without flickering screens, the greatest power lay in the spoken word. And let's be honest, a good ghost story around a fire is still better than most Netflix shows, especially if your phone battery just died. Other scholars argue that while hysteria might have played a role, these outbreaks were often rooted in real, devastating, but poorly understood diseases. Tuberculosis, for example, known as consumption, caused victims to waste away, appearing pale and gaunt, coughing up blood. When one family member died of TB, and then others followed, it was easy to believe the first deceased person was returning from the grave to prey on their relatives, draining their life. The appearance of fresh blood in the coffin, as discussed, could be from internal hemorrhaging. Similarly, diseases like pellagra, caused by nutritional deficiencies, led to skin lesions, delirium, and often death, which could be attributed to the vampire's curse. The vampire became a terrifying, tangible explanation for an invisible, rampant killer. For the vast majority of human history, oral tradition was the primary means of transmitting knowledge, values, and, crucially, fears. This is one of the most common historical facts underpinning the spread of supernatural beliefs. Long before widespread literacy, before Gutenberg revolutionized communication, tales were told and retold, reshaped and refined with each telling. These weren't just idle bedtime stories, they were living narratives, often imbued with a deep sense of truth and practical wisdom. The debate highlights the difficulty in separating folklore from fact in historical accounts, especially when dealing with profound cultural anxieties. Was the vampire a literal monstrous corpse, a projection of communal fear, or a symbolic representation of an invisible epidemic? Perhaps, as is often the case, it was a complex interplay of all these factors, making the terror all the more potent. Imagine a terrifying incident in a nearby village, a body found disinterred, or a mysterious illness sweeping through a family after a sudden death. The immediate, localized fear would be intense. But then, a traveling merchant, a wandering minstrel, a refugee from a distant plague, or simply a visitor at the next market would carry the tale. They wouldn't just state the facts, they would embellish, dramatize, and connect it to existing local superstitions. The story would take root, mutate, and adapt to the new environment, becoming a warning, a prophecy, or a confirmation of existing anxieties. The silence in your hut is broken only by the sound of your own breathing, ragged and a little too fast. You can almost feel the presence of that grotesque, bloated corpse, its breath foul, its eyes fixed on you. The ancient world, with its lack of scientific understanding, was a breeding ground for such horrors. Every inexplicable illness, every sudden death, every disturbing discovery in a grave could be twisted into proof of the undead walking among them. These stories often served multiple purposes. They were entertainment, certainly, providing a thrilling, albeit chilling, diversion from the grinding realities of daily life. But they were also didactic, cautionary tales designed to reinforce social norms or warn against dangerous behaviors. Don't disrespect the dead, or they might rise. Don't wander in the woods at night, or you might meet something unholy. The stories themselves became a form of social control, a way to maintain order through fear, even if the monster was purely mythical. It's like when your parents told you not to touch the stove because it was hot. They didn't need to explain thermal conductivity, just the immediate, painful consequence. The historical accounts are filled with communities gripped by vampire panics. Entire villages would participate in exhumations, driven by a desperate need to find the vampire responsible for their misfortunes. Once identified, the corpse would be subjected to various horrific cures. Think about the structure of these narratives. They often followed predictable patterns: the initial death, the strange occurrences, the growing fear, the desperate attempt to deal with the revenant, and the eventual, often brutal, resolution. This formulaic approach made the stories incredibly sticky, easy to remember, and easy to pass on. A good story, even a terrifying one, is fundamentally about pattern recognition, and the human brain loves a good pattern. It's why catchy jingles get stuck in your head, or why you always know when your cat is about to demand attention with that specific, insistent meow. Heart extraction and burning. The most common and widely believed method. The heart would be removed, often still believed to be beating, and then burned to ashes. The ashes might then be mixed with water and given to the surviving family members as a protective draft. Now let's explore a truly unique and often little-known detail that helped propagate these terrifying tales: the specific role of death songs or lamentations, and the performative nature of storytelling within communities, which often blurred the line between recounting a warning and invoking a presence. These weren't just tales, they were often performances that deeply embedded the supernatural into the communal psyche. Decapitation and reburial. The head would be cut off and buried separately, sometimes between the legs of the corpse, to prevent it from reattaching or guiding the body. Imagine a community gathered not just to hear a story, but to participate in its telling. In some cultures, there were designated lamenters or keeners, whose job it was to wail and mourn ritually, sometimes for hours, expressing the grief and invoking the memory of the deceased. These were not just expressions of sorrow. They were often seen as a way to ensure the dead remained at peace, or conversely, to ward off their restless spirit if they were believed to be angry or vengeful. Staking the body. As mentioned before, a wooden stake, often hawthorn or oak, or an iron spike would be driven through the heart, navel, or even the ground beneath the body, to literally pin the vampire to its grave. Beyond professional mourners, the act of storytelling itself was often a performance. A skilled storyteller wouldn't just recite. They would use vocal changes, gestures, dramatic pauses, and even create sound effects by tapping on surfaces or rustling fabric. They might perform spirit voices or mimic the sounds of chains dragging or footsteps approaching. This performative aspect didn't just entertain, it made the stories feel incredibly real, bypassing the critical faculties of the audience and tapping directly into their primal fears. Burning the entire body. In extreme cases, if the previous methods failed or if the vampire was particularly stubborn, the entire corpse would be exhumed and burned to ashes. This was considered the ultimate destruction, ensuring no return. In some traditions, specific death ballads or mournful songs would be sung, recounting the demise of individuals and the strange phenomena that followed. These songs, often set to haunting melodies, would be repeated for generations, carrying the narrative of the restless dead far and wide. The rhythm and repetition of a song made the details of a haunting easier to remember and transmit than a simple prose account. It was the ancient world's version of a viral video, but instead of dances, it was about your great aunt coming back to steal your socks. Now, let's turn to a truly unique and often little-known detail that directly reflects the belief that the dead could walk and the desperate measures taken to prevent it: the practice of deviant burials, or anti-vampire burials, where bodies were deliberately mutilated or constrained after death to prevent their reanimation. These weren't just random acts of desecration, they were specific, ritualistic interventions designed to ensure the deceased stayed dead. These ritualistic retellings and performances weren't just about sharing information, they were about experiencing the information. When a community collectively shivered at the description of a gaunt, shadowy figure, when their breath hitched at the sound of a medium's spirit voice, they were not just hearing a story, they were, in a very real sense, participating in the construction of their shared reality. The emotional contagion, the collective suspension of disbelief, made the narratives incredibly powerful and deeply ingrained. These rituals, though gruesome, were acts of desperate hope. They were the community's attempts to regain control in the face of an invisible threat, to fight back against a terror that was literally consuming their loved ones. The collective act of hunting, exhuming, and curing the vampire also served a social function, uniting the community against a common enemy, albeit one they themselves had conjured. It's like when everyone in your neighborhood gets together to deal with a wasp nest, but the wasp nest is actually your recently deceased Aunt Mildred, and she's really thirsty. And this brings us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Folklorists and cultural theorists still debate whether the widespread proliferation of Walking Dead narratives was primarily a mechanism for coping with the trauma of death and unexplained phenomena, or if these stories actively serve to legitimize and maintain certain social hierarchies and power structures within communities. Were they a comfort or a control mechanism? The fear wasn't just physical, it was deeply spiritual. Many cultures believed that those who became vampires were cursed, excluded from paradise, or possessed by demonic forces. This added a layer of theological dread to the physical terror. It wasn't just a monster, it was a damned soul, forever trapped in a hideous parody of life, a warning of what could happen if one lived an unclean life or died an improper death. Some scholars argue for the coping mechanism perspective. In this view, stories about ghosts, vampires, and revenants provided a crucial outlet for processing grief, anxiety, and the terrifying randomness of death. If a loved one died suddenly, especially if they were young or healthy, the idea that their spirit lingered, or that they had been taken by a malevolent force, might have been easier to bear than the stark, incomprehensible reality of meaningless loss. The stories provided a framework for understanding, a narrative arc for tragedy. They offered a way to externalize fear, to give a name and a form to the shapeless dread of mortality. It was like creating a monster in your closet so you had something to blame when you couldn't find your favorite snack. You shift uneasily under your blanket, trying to push away the vivid images of exhumed bodies and desperate rituals. The silence of the ancient night is no longer peaceful. It's pregnant with the unspoken fears of a world that didn't understand what happens after the last breath. The faint, sweet smell of decay, the unsettling whispers of forgotten languages, they all combine to paint a chilling picture of a time when the dead were truly thought to walk among us. Not as benevolent spirits, but as terrifying, blood-hungry fiends. The line between natural decomposition and supernatural horror was utterly blurred, leading to centuries of terror and gruesome countermeasures, all stemming from a profound and terrifying misunderstanding. You close your eyes, wishing for the gentle hum of your modern fan, anything to dispel the chilling presence of the historical vampire. Other scholars propose a more critical interpretation, suggesting that these narratives often served to reinforce existing social orders. The dead who returned were often those who had transgressed social norms in life, or those who died in peculiar circumstances, hinting at a divine judgment. The stories of vampires feeding on the virtuous could be interpreted as warnings against gluttony or selfishness. The fear of a revenant might be used by religious authorities to emphasize the importance of proper burial rites and adherence to religious dogma. Furthermore, the belief in spirits and the supernatural often empowered shamans, priests, or other spiritual leaders, giving them authority to mediate between the living and the dead, thus consolidating their social power. If you're the only one who can talk to the angry ghost, you suddenly become very important to the villagers. The chilling echo of ancient vampire panics still whispers in the air around your simple hut, a testament to the visceral fear of the reanimated corpse. You've journeyed through misinterpretations of decay and disease, understanding how easily natural phenomena could be twisted into monstrous proof. But what if the dead didn't just accidentally return? What if there were those who deliberately sought to bring them back, or to harness their power for their own dark purposes tonight? We step into the shadowed realm of magic, where the lines between the living and the dead were not just blurred by fear, but actively crossed by those who dared to dabble in the dark arts. This debate highlights the multi-layered function of folklore. It's likely that these narratives served both purposes simultaneously. They provided emotional catharsis and communal understanding, while also, perhaps subtly, reinforcing societal structures and moral codes. The stories were fluid, adaptable, capable of reflecting and shaping the anxieties of a particular time and place. You shift on your rough sleeping mat, pulling the blanket tighter, as the ambient sounds of the ancient night seem to deepen. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the unseen forest, even the faint crackle of your small, banked fire, they all take on a more sinister quality. You imagine shrouded figures, cloaked and hooded, moving through the moonlit landscape, carrying strange bundles and muttering incantations. Because in this time, the greatest terror might not just be the unexpected return of the dead, but the deliberate conjuring of them by those who would use their power for ill. And if you think your internet connection is slow when you're trying to stream, imagine trying to download a spirit from the afterlife using a goat skull and some bat wings. Not exactly high-speed broadband. As you listen to the fire crackle, imagining the ancient voices that once filled such spaces, you understand the profound impact of these transmitted tales. It wasn't just individual experiences that cemented the belief in the Walking Dead. It was the collective memory, the shared stories, the narrative inheritance passed down through generations. Each ghost story, each vampire legend, each cautionary tale about a corpse that wouldn't stay buried, built upon the last, creating a vast, intricate web of supernatural belief that was incredibly difficult to untangle. The belief that magic could influence the spiritual realm, particularly for communication with or manipulation of the dead, is an ancient and widespread phenomenon. This practice, often termed necromancy, from the Greek nekros, meaning dead body, and manteia, meaning divination, was viewed with a mixture of terror and fascination across nearly all ancient and medieval cultures. It wasn't just a simple superstition, it was considered a powerful, dangerous, and often blasphemous art that sought to usurp the natural order of life and death. The very act of sharing these stories created a communal reality, a shared understanding of the world where the veil between life and death was thin and permeable. You might not have seen a ghost yourself, but your neighbors swore they did, and their grandfather had a story about a ghoul, and the local bard sang a ballad about a cursed revenant. Soon, the individual experience became universal truth, reinforced by the constant echo of collective fear. It's like when everyone starts using a new slang term. You might not get it at first, but if everyone around you says it, you eventually pick it up and start using it too, whether you fully understand it or not. One of the most common historical facts related to this belief is the pervasive fear and condemnation of necromancy across diverse historical periods and cultures, often codified in religious texts and legal codes, from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt to classical Greece and Rome. And especially throughout medieval and early modern Europe, communicating with the dead for magical purposes was almost universally forbidden and seen as an abomination. The Bible, for instance, explicitly condemns those who consult the dead. Roman law similarly punished those who practiced dark magic, including necromancy. In medieval Europe, the rise of the Inquisition saw accusations of necromancy linked directly to heresy and devil worship, making it one of the gravest possible crimes. Even as societies advanced, as cities grew and literacy spread, the power of these deeply ingrained oral traditions lingered. Books might have replaced the campfire as the primary medium, but the stories themselves, the archetypes of the Walking Dead, had already sunk deep into the collective subconscious. They continued to be adapted, reinterpreted, and presented in new forms, but the core fear, the fundamental belief, remained. You can still feel the chilling resonance of those ancient voices, whispering tales of what happens when the final curtain falls, and then, perhaps, rises again. The stories are etched not just in history, but in the very way we imagine the unseen. This condemnation wasn't just theoretical. There are countless historical records of individuals being accused, tried, and severely punished, often by execution, for allegedly practicing necromancy. These trials, though often based on flimsy evidence and fueled by mass hysteria, demonstrate the very real terror societies had of those who dared to tamper with the souls of the deceased. The fear was that these practitioners weren't just asking questions, they were commanding spirits. Perhaps even raising corpses for malevolent ends to reveal secrets, to curse enemies, to find hidden treasures, or even to manipulate fate itself. It was the ultimate forbidden knowledge, the spiritual equivalent of hacking into the universe's mainframe. The echoes of ancient voices, whispering tales of the walking dead around flickering campfires, still linger in your mind. You've journeyed through the unsettling realities of medical misunderstanding, the chilling ingenuity of deviant burials, the pervasive fears woven into folklore, and the strange tricks of the human brain. You've seen how, for countless generations, the line between life and death felt terrifyingly permeable, how the concept of the truly gone was a fragile thing. But what happens to these deeply ingrained fears, these pervasive beliefs, when the world undeniably shifts, when science progresses, medicine improves, and the shadows begin to recede from the corners of our understanding tonight? We explore the enduring legacy of fear, how these ancient anxieties mutated, adapted, and continued to haunt us, even in an age of reason. The practice was often associated with dark, solitary places, graveyards at midnight, desolate crossroads, forgotten ruins. The practitioner, often depicted as a reclusive scholar poring over forbidden texts or a withered hag muttering over bubbling cauldrons, would perform elaborate rituals designed to compel the spirits to appear or to reveal their knowledge. The underlying belief was that the dead, especially those who died tragically or had unfinished business, retained a connection to the earthly realm, a connection that a skilled, or perhaps foolish, necromancer could exploit. You open your eyes, not to a smoky tavern or a dim hut, but to a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere around you. The gaslights have given way to electric bulbs, the horse-drawn carriages to early automobiles. You're in the early 20th century, a time of unprecedented technological advancement and burgeoning psychology. Yet, beneath the veneer of progress, the old fears persist. Because even as the logical explanations for phenomena grew stronger, the stories, the primal anxieties, had sunk too deep into the collective subconscious to simply vanish. And let's be honest, even with all our smarts today, if you hear a strange bump in the night, your first thought probably isn't thermal expansion of the rafters, it's, oh great. Now, let's delve into a truly unique and often little-known detail that highlights the grotesque lengths to which belief in necromancy could go, the specific and often gruesome ingredients and ritualistic components believed to be essential for successful conjurations, as detailed in various ancient grimoires and forbidden texts. While I won't be citing specific grimoires directly, it's important to understand the types of materials thought necessary. One of the most common historical facts that demonstrates the persistence of these fears, even as the world modernized, is the continued popularity of ghost stories, seances, and supernatural investigations, often leveraging new technologies for proof. While the overt fear of being buried alive might have receded with medical advances, the desire to connect with the dead and the thrill of the unknown simply shifted forms. The Victorian spiritualism we touched upon in our previous series, with its mediums and spirit photography, didn't just fade away with the turn of the century, it evolved. Imagine the practitioner preparing for their dark ritual. It wasn't just about chanting some words. These rituals often called for incredibly disturbing components. Imagine a group gathered not around a dark table for rapping, but around a primitive phonograph, hoping to capture spirit voices. Or perhaps they're clutching early cameras, trying to snap photos of ephemeral ectoplasm. The rise of radio and early electronic recording devices led to a new phenomenon, electronic voice phenomena, EVP, where seemingly disembodied voices would appear on recordings, often believed to be the voices of the dead communicating from beyond. These weren't just misinterpretations of natural sounds, they were often sought out, amplified, and debated with fervent passion. It was the original, is this thing on, but with a much higher spectral stakes. Human remains. Pieces of corpses were highly prized. This might include fingers, hair, teeth, bones, or even parts of internal organs. The belief was that by possessing a piece of the deceased, the necromancer gained a direct physical link to their spirit. The fresher the remains, the better. Imagine needing to borrow a femur from a recently buried grave just to get some life advice. Not exactly a trip to the self-help aisle. This new wave of technological spiritualism demonstrates a core human truth, even when the reasons for believing in walking dead or communicating spirits change. The desire for it often remains. The grief of loss, the fear of oblivion, the inherent human curiosity about what lies beyond. These are timeless anxieties that transcend scientific discovery. If a scientist offers you a rational explanation for a phenomenon, but a spiritualist offers you a chance to speak to your departed mother, which one do you think is going to win in the hearts contest? It's not always about logic, is it? Blood and bodily fluids. Often, the blood of the living, including the necromancer's own, or even fluids from a decomposing corpse, were believed to be powerful conduits. These were used to draw magical circles, anoint objects, or as offerings. The public's appetite for ghost stories, tales of the reanimated, and accounts of the paranormal never truly dwindled. It simply moved from oral tradition and local gossip to popular literature, stage plays, and eventually, the nascent forms of mass media. Authors like M.R. James perfected the chilling ghost story for a literate audience, while penny dreadfuls and sensational newspapers capitalized on tales of vampires, ghouls, and strange hauntings. These stories reinforced the cultural archetypes of the Walking Dead, ensuring that even if people weren't staking corpses anymore, they still knew exactly what a vampire was supposed to look like, or how a restless spirit might manifest. Objects of the deceased personal items, clothing, or grave goods buried with the dead were also thought to hold a spiritual imprint, making them useful in attracting the specific spirit desired. Now, let's turn to a truly unique and often little-known detail about how these ancient fears adapted and found new life in the modern era. The surprising influence of embalming and modern funeral practices on both assuaging and, paradoxically, subtly reinforcing certain anxieties about the dead. While designed to prevent premature burial and offer hygienic preservation, they also created a new kind of undead aesthetic. Specific animals, black cats, toads, owls, and other creatures associated with darkness or witchcraft were sometimes incorporated, either as sacrifices, components, or familiars assisting the ritual. Imagine the Victorian concept of the good death, a peaceful passing at home, surrounded by family, with the body laid out for viewing, often for days, to allow proper mourning. As cities grew and sanitation became a concern, coupled with the desire for bodies to be transported long distances, the practice of embalming gained widespread acceptance, especially after its popularization during the American Civil War to bring soldiers home. Herbs and poisons. Certain plants, especially those with hallucinogenic or toxic properties like deadly nightshade, hemlock, or opium poppies, were used to induce trance states in the necromancer, or as offerings to the spirits. The idea was to create a liminal mental state conducive to perceiving the ethereal. Embalming, with its chemical preservation and cosmetic enhancement, allowed the deceased to look peaceful, natural, and asleep for extended periods. This undoubtedly brought comfort to many, allowing for extended goodbyes without the rapid and unsettling changes of natural decomposition. It put a definitive end to the fear of being buried alive, as the body was clearly no longer in a state that could reanimate. It's like putting a very robust seal on a jar. You know nothing's getting in or out. These aren't just details from a horror movie. These were the actual documented beliefs in how one performed such dark magic. The collection of these materials would have been a dangerous and macabre undertaking, reinforcing the extreme taboo nature of necromancy. The very act of seeking and preparing these components would have deeply unsettled anyone aware of it, cementing the idea that those who practiced such arts were truly dealing with forces beyond human comprehension and perhaps beyond human morality. However, paradoxically, this artificial preservation also created a new kind of unnerving presence. The embalmed body, perfectly still, unnaturally serene, yet undeniably not alive, became its own kind of Walking Dead aesthetic, in a subtle psychological sense. It was the ultimate uncanny valley, something that looked perfectly human, but was utterly lifeless. This perfected corpse, forever paused between life and decay, may have subtly fed into the enduring fascination with beings that straddle the line between worlds. And this leads us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Historians still debate whether the numerous medieval and early modern accusations of necromancy and witchcraft, particularly those involving conjuring the dead, reflect actual widespread attempts to practice such dark arts. Or if these accusations were primarily a manifestation of deep-seated societal anxieties, religious fervor, political maneuvering, or even a misunderstanding of ritualistic practices. Were there really covens of people trying to summon ghosts with human bones? Or was it a convenient narrative for power and control? Furthermore, consider the meticulously crafted rituals around modern wakes and visitations. The body, often in its finest clothes, laid out in a coffin, inviting people to approach, touch if permitted, and speak to it. This continued the ancient human need for direct interaction with the deceased, but with the added layer of preservation. The appearance of continued wholeness, even if chemically induced, arguably reinforced the mental image of the deceased as not quite gone, perhaps just sleeping, waiting for a final spiritual departure. It's like seeing a beautifully crafted doll. It looks so real, but its stillness is what makes it subtly unsettling. Some scholars argue that while genuine belief in magic was widespread, actual practice of elaborate necromantic rituals as described in grimoires was rare. Instead, accusations often stemmed from, and this brings us to a fascinating and still debated point of academic discussion. Cultural anthropologists and sociologists still debate whether the enduring popularity of zombies, vampires, and other Walking Dead archetypes in modern popular culture movies. TV games is primarily a reflection of deep-seated, persistent anxieties about death and the unknown, or if it has largely become a form of entertainment, disconnected from genuine fear and serving as a safe outlet for primal urges. Is it still about fear or just fun? Religious persecution. The church saw any attempt to bypass divine authority or to seek knowledge outside of sanctioned channels as heresy. Accusations of necromancy were often a tool to suppress dissenting thought or rival spiritual practices. Some scholars argue for the persistence of anxiety perspective. They suggest that despite scientific advances, the fundamental human fear of death, disease, and the breakdown of social order remains. Zombies, with their infectious nature and relentless horde mentality, can be seen as metaphors for plagues, pandemics, or the collapse of civilization. Vampires, with their predatory immortality, embody fears of exploitation, aging, and the dark side of eternal life. In this view, modern media simply provides a new, safe canvas for exploring these ancient anxieties. We consume these stories because they tap into primal fears that haven't truly gone away, even if we articulate them differently. It's like how you still jump when your phone buzzes unexpectedly, even though you know it's just a notification, not a giant spider. Social control. Blaming mysterious deaths, illnesses, or misfortunes on a local witch or necromancer provided a scapegoat and a way for communities to rationalize inexplicable events. It was a mechanism for externalizing internal fears and reinforcing social order through terror. Other scholars propose that these archetypes have largely been desacralized and transformed into pure entertainment. The zombie apocalypse, for instance, is often less about the horror of the undead and more about survivalism, character development, or even dark comedy. Vampires have been romanticized and turned into heroes or anti-heroes, far removed from their plague-spreading, corpse-eating origins. In this view, modern audiences consume these stories not because they genuinely fear a reanimated corpse knocking on their door, but because they enjoy the thrilling escape, the action, and the exploration of extreme scenarios. The fear is more of a pleasurable adrenaline rush than a deep-seated existential dread. It's like riding a roller coaster. You know you're safe. But the thrill comes from the simulated danger. Political intrigue. Accusations of witchcraft or necromancy could be powerful weapons against political rivals, allowing powerful figures to eliminate threats by branding them as demonic. This debate highlights the complex relationship between ancient fears and modern entertainment. It's likely a nuanced combination. The archetypes draw their power from primal human anxieties, but modern storytelling often packages them in ways that allow for both thrilling catharsis and lighthearted escapism. The ancient fear of the dead walking has been commercialized, but its roots remain deep in the human psyche. Misunderstanding of folk magic. Many folk traditions involved harmless charms, herbal remedies, or prayers that, to an outsider or an accuser, might look like sinister magic, especially if interpreted through the lens of a strict religious dogma. As you consider the enduring power of these stories, you realize that while the specific manifestations of the Walking Dead have changed, from rotting revenants to sparkling vampires, the core human anxieties remain remarkably constant. We still fear death, we still fear the unknown, and we still grapple with the concept of what truly happens when life leaves the body. The narratives we create, whether ancient folklore or blockbuster movies, are our way of making sense of these profound mysteries, of giving form to our shapeless dread. This perspective emphasizes that the fear of necromancy might have been more prevalent and impactful than the actual practice. The narratives surrounding necromancers served a crucial social function, shaping beliefs about good and evil, divine and demonic, and providing a framework for explaining chaos in a world that craved order. It's like when everyone blames the office printer for all their problems, even though the real issue is someone keeps putting the paper in upside down, the faint hum of your fan, the soft glow of your bedside lamp. They are symbols of a world that has tamed many of the physical dangers that once fueled these fears. But the shadows of doubt, the whispers of what might be, they still linger. The human imagination, always eager to fill in the blanks, will likely continue to populate the space beyond the veil with restless spirits, hungry creatures, and the echoes of those who refuse to stay buried. You can almost feel the presence of all those stories, all those fears, all those desperate attempts to understand the ultimate mystery, swirling softly around you. Other scholars suggest that while the above factors were certainly at play, the sheer number of documented grimoires books of magic and the persistent nature of these beliefs across centuries indicate that some individuals genuinely attempted to engage in these practices even if their success was a matter of belief, delusion, or clever trickery. The human desire for power, knowledge, and control over fate is a strong motivator, and for some, dabbling in the dark arts, including communication with the dead, was a tempting path, regardless of the risks.